Welcome back to the Oscar Project Podcast, the show where I discuss Oscar-nominated films year by year. I am your host, Jonathan Eaterberg, and today I'll be discussing the 1929 film, The Divine Lady, with my friend Janelle Miley, who writes the Right Now You Like Me newsletter. Janelle, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So before we get into today's film, tell listeners a little bit about who you are and where they can find your work.
So I'm Janelle Miley. I'm just kind of a self-proclaimed Oscars enthusiast. I write the newsletter Right Now You Like Me on Substack, where currently I'm reviewing every Best Picture nominee, starting from the very first Oscar. So I try to approach each review, especially for a lot of these older films, with kind of a modern but very lighthearted and irreverent perspective. I really don't take it very seriously.
Got to take some of these older films with a grain of salt, I've found.
For sure.
Well, before we get into The Divine Lady, I want to update our place in history like we've been doing all this season on the podcast. So our last film came out towards the end of February. So we're looking at the end of February, and then this film is the end of March. So a couple of things that if there weren't any major births or deaths that I came across of any famous folks in this period. We had Grand Teton National Park was established on February 26th in Wyoming. Film news, March 3rd, William Fox, the owner of the Fox Film Corporation, announced a merger between Fox and Lowe's theater chain. And then another film thing, March 17th, Mickey Mouse had a short cartoon called Plain Crazy released. It was actually the first one of his films to be made, but the fourth one shown in theaters, obviously the first one being Steamboat Willie back towards the end of 1928, which we covered a little bit ago. In politics, we had the inauguration of Herbert Hoover as the 31st president of the United States on March 4th. And then in sports, we had a really good thing and really bad things. February 28th, the Chicago Blackhawks failed to score a goal in their 8th straight game, which apparently is still a record in the NHL that stands to this day, almost 100 years later. And then on the good side, March 29th, the Boston Bruins won their first Stanley Cup, defeating the defending champion New York Rangers in 2 games. So that's our roundup of news and sports and politics in the world of March 1929. Anything you want to add to that?
No, I had almost all the same things written down in my notes. One other movie thing, March 24th, the musical film Syncopation was the first movie released by RKO Pictures that year.
Okay.
Yeah, and apparently Al Capone also had a busy week that last week of March because he appeared in front of the grand jury in Chicago a couple times.
Yeah, I saw his name pop up. I didn't jot the note down on that, but I did see his name as I was doing a little bit of research.
Big Al Capone times.
Oh yes, yep. He was a busy guy through that era for not always the right reasons, of course.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on to the film itself. The Divine Lady first appeared in theaters in the U.S. on March 31st, 1929. Although I did see somewhere in my research that it was actually like the 22nd or something, about a week or a week and a half earlier. So don't know what the exact date was on it. We'll stick with March 31st. That's what I found when I was originally setting up the season. It was directed by Frank Lloyd and written by Forrest Halsey and Agnes Christine Johnston, with intertitles by Harry Carr, and it is based on the 1924 novel The Divine Lady, A Romance of Nelson and Emma Hamilton by E. Barrington.
It stars Corinne Griffith as Emma Hart, Victor Barconi as Horatio Nelson, H.B. Warner as Sir William Hamilton. And the film has a runtime of 99 minutes and was produced by First National Pictures and distributed by Warner Brothers.
And of course, Frank Lloyd won the award for Best Director at the Second Academy Awards for this film. And Griffith was also nominated for Best Actress for her role. And John F. Seitz received a nomination for Best Cinematography. Film is readily available both on YouTube as well as a DVD release as of this recording. So you can definitely go find it if you are interested. So we'll jump into the kind of a plot overview of the film and kind of go off as we see fit. The film opens with a title card introducing it as, quote, the historic tale of 2 people whose lives are an immortal romance, the story of the love and destiny of England's greatest beauty and England's greatest sailor. So we're already setting up for some grand romance, grand adventure right at the beginning.
Huge expectations right at the top. The greatest beauty and the greatest sailor, which, Horatio Nelson was certainly no slouch. So I think that at least that part of it's accurate.
Yeah. And so obviously we're studying in the late 1700s, 1782, I think it is. We meet Gravel, who is this wealthy man living in town. He's admiring a painting that's been done of, I think, his uncle, if I remember correctly.
Mhm.
And then we see a carriage arrive, and we are introduced to the new cook and her daughter, and the daughter being Emma, of course.
Yeah, we're kind of like starting off as this if you know nothing else about like Emma Hart's story, you would kind of assume from this first scene that this is setting up to be like a Pygmalion, like rags to riches
Yeah.
story, which it kind of is a little bit. I think the actual story of Lady Hamilton isn't quite that. She wasn't quite that impoverished.
Yeah.
So, a little bit of exaggeration for narrative effect, but you're kind of like setting up this expectation that, she's coming into Gribel's life to become this great, society lady, which is partially correct.
Yeah, and I really didn't know. I mean, I'd heard the names, but I had never really heard the story. I didn't really know too much about them, as they went into this film. So it was very, and going in, I for the first 20, 30 minutes, I expected Ravel to be the love interest going
Yeah.
in here. And I mean, you don't meet, Horatio until at least a third, if not a halfway through the film, which is a little bit surprising given how important he is as a character to the story.
Yeah, I noticed that too. My second watch, I kind of timed like how far into the movie you actually get before you meet Horatio. And by then she's already had two love interests already. So it's like, oh, you're set up thinking it's gonna be between her and Greville, and then you're kind of like, oh, it's actually gonna be between her and Hamilton. And then, oh, wait, actually, the love story's not here yet.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So we get some scenes. The Gravel is not too impressed with her at the very beginning. Kind of tells her that she's got to change her ways, become a better person, sort of thing. And if she's able to do that, he'll let her stay. And eventually, she ends up getting kind of shipped off to the uncle. That's Sir Hamilton, and so she's shipped off with the uncle to and ends up in Naples after some routings here and there. And eventually, that's where she becomes Lady Hamilton. Ends up marrying Sir Hamilton after some studies and some, I guess, trying to better herself. I guess she does enough of a job so that she can become his wife. She's learning Italian. She's dancing. Does a lot of stuff there in Naples throughout that whole sequence. And I thought some of the when they first arrive in Naples, her and her mother, I thought that was some really beautiful imagery. I could see the best cinematography nomination in a lot of those sequences there. It really shine through.
Yeah, I think that's the point where this movie did get a little more, like, visually interesting for me, and I could kinda see that best cinematography nomination coming through because the first maybe the first act is maybe not super visually impressive,
Yeah.
but yeah, once they kinda go over into Naples and get more into, like, these battle scenes especially are incredible, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. But yeah, it wasn't until now when the movie really kinda, like, caught my attention visually.
Yeah, definitely. And so eventually she becomes, or Hamilton becomes the ambassador. The title card that I have that I noted down, it says that the tells us that the cook's daughter became ambassadress in a court watched with hungry eyes by England and France. That's another scene where we get the Queen of Naples, whose name I didn't write down. I should have written that down. But obviously, very hoity-toity. Everybody's dressed to the
Mhm.
nines in the typical garb of the day that we would see in paintings and the aristocracy wearing at that time. And she's obviously fits in there well enough. She's no longer just the cook's daughter. She's fitting in there well enough to get by and managing to hobnob with the rich and famous of the day.
Yeah, and her relationship with the Queen of Naples is interesting because she kind of, like, becomes her confidant. It is something I wish the film, like, explored a little more, or we could have maybe gotten more scenes of just them together because I found that relationship really interesting and how she kind of convinces the Queen later on to, talk to the king, get him to, help the British army out, while they're or not the army, the fleet go when they're, struggling. Everybody's starving and dying from scurvy. They really need help, but the king just refuses at first, but it's the queen who kinda, like, nudges him to get them the help that they need to kind of see the war through. And that's really all kind of thanks to Emma. And I think it's super interesting because I think you can kind of credit her background as not starting out as like a lady of society. I think she's kind of like a
Right.
little more bold, a little more forthright. They call her vulgar a bunch of times in the beginning
Yeah.
of the movie. And it's like she's vulgar for singing, I guess. But, different times.
And she's willing to speak her mind she doesn't. I don't think you're right. She doesn't have that established decor of the court that she has to adhere to because she doesn't necessarily come from that world. So I think that that's what allows her to be a little more outspoken in those situations.
Yeah, exactly.
So as you mentioned, obviously there's war going on in Europe. There's revolutions everywhere. Let's kind of fast forward at this point to the late 1790s. Naples is caught in between Britain and France. The Queen of Naples, whose sister is Marie Antoinette, finds out that Marie Antoinette has been killed in that revolution. So lots of things going on. I think like you mentioned earlier, it's a perfect chance to bring up some of those battle scenes, the naval battle scenes, which
Mhm.
again, like you said, are amazing. I was astounded at some of the things that they were able to do almost 100 years ago in some of those shots.
Yeah, it's kind of funny how, like, these early movies really, didn't pull any punches with, like, war scenes. 'Cause you see movies like, Wings that are famous for their, like, set pieces that are just you think, "Well, how did they do that?" With, their way more limited resources and technology back then. So yeah, seeing these ocean battle scenes, it was like and it's very seamless. So, whatever tricks they might have had up their sleeve. And I didn't find too much about the actual making of those scenes. I don't know if you have any production notes. I was
I
I was
don't.
scouring, looking for something, but either way, whether I don't know if they used like models a lot of the time, but either way, it looked terrific.
Yeah, I'm sure they had malls, but I mean, there were plenty of scenes where there were guys running around on the decks and
Yeah.
climbing the ropes and doing all the stuff that would a lot of which would be CGI nowadays. So
Yeah, exactly.
I can't imagine having people do that, let alone getting cameras in position to do that. The one good thing, I guess, in terms of this is that it is right in that transition between silent and sound where they didn't have, all they had to worry about was putting a camera somewhere to capture that. They didn't have to worry about audio for all of that as well.
Yeah, totally.
Which actually brings me to another point, and that's I think it was just before this when she initially meets Horatio, before the whole war sequences start going on, when she's playing the harp and kind of singing, and it doesn't really feel like she's actually singing, but it's the voice is pretty well synced up with the visual on the screen, at least in the version that I was watching. So I think that's that was their attempt to do the a little bit of the jazz singer, a little bit of some of the other films that were coming out around this time, because obviously you had to do something in order to stay current with that new technology.
Yeah, totally, and you can see we'll talk about, like, the reviews later, but it was something that even then, like, they noticed that, like, the syncing was, like, a little off, so it's kind of funny how, like, even then, with this sound being so new, they were still, like, pretty critical of how it was, coming off on screen, like,
Yeah.
you could tell that it was not Corinne Griffith actually singing, and it was just like, "Man, y'all are brutal." Can't win, got this brand new technology we're trying to, like, show off or, like, ease into, and it's just not good enough for the critics, which I
Yeah.
thought was really funny. But yeah, you can kinda tell that there are a couple times when she is, like, singing because that's kind of part of her charm is, like, her singing voice and her dancing, and, that's also part of, like, her vulgarity of,
Yeah.
this woman dancing and singing in public, how scandalous. But yeah, it's part of, like, what draws people to her, but you can definitely tell it's not Corinne Griffith singing at all, and at points, it doesn't even look like she's singing the same song on screen as what's, like, being played.
Yeah, and at the same time, I was able, like you were saying at the very beginning, watching these movies with, giving it a little bit of benefit of the doubt. I was willing to overlook that. I was just impressed that they were able to get that in there at this time period.
Totally.
So you mentioned earlier the British fleet. They're under the command of Captain Nelson, Admiral Nelson. I can't remember if he's captain or admiral at this point. But they're in dire straits. They're kind of begging for help from King Ferdinand, I think it was, of
Mhm.
Naples. No, Austria. Naples? I can't remember. Doesn't really matter. They're begging for help. They don't get it because they don't want to anger the French. And again, this is that part where she steps up. The queen sides with her as much as she can, but again, can't fully go against the king's wishes. But they do end up getting some help from Sicily. They're allowed in any port in Sicily and are able to kind of restock, and eventually they are able to turn the tide, so to speak, of the war in their favor. After all of that is done, there's some scenes where Nelson is kind of resting after the war period is over, resting in Italy, and come to find out, or found out at some point through all of this, that he's married back in England. Obviously, Emma is married to Hamilton still as well, so they're both married, but obviously they've got feelings for each other and want to do some things there. So some conflict begins to emerge in terms of the love triangle, quadrangle, whatever you want to call it, of many people trying to deal with each other.
Yeah, and I love the line from Hamilton, when Greville is talking to him about these rumors about, Emma and Horatio having an affair. I'm paraphrasing, but, I don't pay much attention to rumors, they might be true, which is, like, a very funny, he's just kind of, "Whatever's happening, it's none of my business."
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah.
like, "This is your wife," but in reading a little more about Hamilton himself, the real guy, and I'm the same way, this era of history is a total blind spot for me. I'm not a history buff in general, but this era was totally, not my wheelhouse. I didn't know any of these people. But apparently this kind of like was how he dealt with it in real life. Like he was a widower when he met Emma, so I think that might have played a part where it's like, this isn't really my true love, so he enjoyed her companionship, but maybe it just wasn't the most important thing to him. So I did find that line really, like, striking.
And the whole relationship there, I mean, it obviously she seemed much closer in age to Gravel when they first meet at the very beginning.
Yeah.
And then Hamilton is Gravel's uncle, so you would assume he's
Mhm.
at least 15, 20, maybe even more years older. So obviously I think the age, and again, I don't know the exact facts, but I would imagine the age difference between Hamilton and Emma was quite big.
I wanna say when I was reading up about this, I wanna say he was, like, in his 50s when he lost his first wife, like, 55 or so. So he was significantly older than Emma
Yeah.
at this point.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe it's just a thing of he just needs a wife and he's gonna let her have her fun as long as she still
Right.
can say that she's his wife.
Which, hey, I'm all for that.
Yeah, yeah.
Putting his ego aside a little bit.
Right, right. So eventually we get back to England. There's a newspaper announcement that Nelson has returned and Emma is by his side. That's where we kind of get the announcement of her infidelity between Gravel and Hamilton. And they're supposed to go to a party, kind of a celebratory party of the return. Nelson is introduced with his wife at the party. He's kind of looking around for Emma, but then Hamilton doesn't show up with Emma. Instead, he shows up with Ravel as his plus one. So Nelson's wondering, where is she? What's going on? And obviously, it's kind of one of those things where someone came by and said, the king or queen, whoever is in charge, says, "Don't come to this party, or it's going to get nasty."
Yeah, the visual of, like, seeing her name, like, physically struck out on the invitation, really, it just hammers it home that this was, like, quite the scandal. Maybe Hamilton is forgiving of it, but the public sure wasn't going to be.
Yeah. So eventually, Nelson kind of gets insulted on Emma's behalf for the uninvite, saying, and he's kind of saying that she's the one that made the victory possible. She's the one that influenced the queen in Naples to help them. And his wife basically says, "Well, if you go to her, I'm done." She's not quite as understanding as Hamilton is. So of course he goes off, and we kind of jump forward again a little bit in time to Emma and Nelson together, kind of living a quiet life hidden away in a village. But of course, the military finds him. They come and kind of call him back to the service, and eventually he does agree to go face off against the French fleet once again. And during the battle, towards the end of the film, he is shot and eventually passes away during that battle, and kind of hears Emma's voice at the very end singing the song that she sang for him when they first met. Some really nice flashbacks and kind of overlay scenes in there at the very end. But again, don't know if that's how it actually happened, but it certainly works well for the purpose of the film and doing that visually at the end in terms of that storytelling.
I like to think that's how it happened. I like to think that that was Horatio's, like, final thoughts as he was dying.
Yeah. Well, anything missed in terms of the plot? Like I said, there's a lot more detail we could go into, but I think that's pretty much the overview, at least as I had it.
Yeah, yeah, I think you nailed it without getting, like, too nitty-gritty.
Right. Yeah. If you want to get more nitty gritty, just go watch the movie.
Yeah. It's short.
Yep. So, in terms of the folks who were involved in making the film, obviously I've already covered Frank Lloyd a couple times on the podcast. He was actually nominated for Best Director for 3 of his films that he made this year, winning for this film, obviously. And we would also going to come back to him in a couple years. He directed Mutiny on the Bounty, which was a Best Picture winner in from 1935. So we'll be back to him in a little bit. Anything you want to touch on with Mr. Lloyd?
Yeah, so I've seen this is the 3rd of his films I've seen so far. So it would be this, Cavalcade, and I forget what the other one was. Oh, East Lynne, all of which were, Oscar nominated movies. This one is particularly interesting because he was nominated for Best Director, but the film itself wasn't, or he won for Best Director, but the film itself was not nominated for Best Picture, which is so rare that he's the only guy that that's happened to. Technically, Milestone won for best comedy direction, but that's a defunct category, so
Right.
it's like a gray area of whether that one counts or not. But yeah, it hasn't happened since then, which is a wild stat. But I mean, when you think about it, like nowadays we nominate 10 best picture nominees,
Right.
so it's way less likely to happen now. It's more the other way around where films are nominated for best picture but not for best director, which gets a little controversial.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I've seen Mutiny on the Bounty several years ago. Actually, I think I watched it in class in college in one of my film classes as well. But it's interesting seeing this one for the first time and thinking of the naval scenes in that. Obviously, it's much more of a naval film. Mutiny on the
Mhm.
Bounty is, but seeing some of that juxtaposition, using some of what he learned on this film to inform that, I'm sure, down the road.
Yeah, I haven't seen Mutiny on the Bounty yet. I'm obviously gonna cover it soon, so I'm looking forward to it because so far I haven't been too crazy about Frank Lloyd, and we'll talk about, my personal, thoughts on this film a little bit later, but so far he's 0 for 3 for me. So I'm curious. I'm very, curious and excited to, see if that changes once I see Mutiny on the Bounty or any of these other films.
Yeah, I think I definitely prefer Mutiny on the Bounty to this, but I'm lukewarm on this one, Felix, but we'll get to that at the end. In terms of the writers, Forrest Halsey worked as a novelist and screenwriter, had a bunch of short stories. He wrote on over 60 films between 1913 and 1942. Agnes Christine Johnson, she's listed as a screenwriter for the sake of continuity. Did a lot of work in the silent era, had a few sound films from what I could see, but it doesn't look like she transitioned into writing sound films very much. And then Harry Carr, who wrote all the intertitles, was a reporter and columnist for the Los Angeles Times. So doing double duty there for him. Always interesting to see the multiple facets that the writers of these films, they're not just sitting there writing for film, they're also doing other stuff, whether it's newspaper, magazines, short stories, whatever. They're busy.
Yeah, it's funny how way more common that was back then, whereas, like, now a screenwriter's usually just a screenwriter
Yeah.
or maybe a playwright or maybe a novelist, but
Right.
you don't have your hands in too many things now.
And then a lot of times, the now I'm thinking of folks like Suzanne Collins for the Hunger Games movies. Like she's given a
Yeah.
screenwriting credit, but she's probably not sitting there, writing the actual script. She's probably coming in and consulting and stuff like that.
Yeah, and it's like a story by credit,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. In terms of the actors, are Corinne Griffith, Miss Emma Hart herself, and Hamilton. This is actually towards the end of her film career, as she retired from acting in 1932. The interesting bit I had about her was that she married George Preston Marshall in 1936, who was the owner of the Washington Redskins football team. And according to one of the things I read, she actually wrote the lyrics to the team's fight song, which is titled "Hail to the Redskins." Obviously, the team's been renamed since then with much public fanfare, but interesting connection there between her and the sports world as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know that she wrote the theme song. Yeah, she's a bit of an interesting lady too, because yeah, she didn't fully make the transition into like sound, yeah, retired in 1932. She had one acting credit after that in the 1960s,
Yeah, I
and
saw that.
that was pretty much it. And then she basically focused on writing, and then she invested in real estate, and she died like a millionaire. So she's kind of an interesting lady, very like one of the wealthiest women in the world at the time. And I did the plugged her net worth at the time that she died in 79 was 150 million, which would be 658 million today.
Wow.
So she was
She was doing all right.
yeah, she was doing great. Real girl boss.
Yeah, definitely, and which is a little surprising because I never really heard of her until this. Obviously,
Yeah.
focusing more on later films and with the not of the silent era, but if you focused in on that time period before sound, then you probably would have heard of her a little bit better.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm going to talk about Victor Varconi, who plays Rachel Nelson, and H.B. Warner, who plays Hamilton, together. And the reason for that is that they both were also in Cecil B. DeMille's 1927 silent film, The King of Kings. Victor Varconi played Pontius Pilate, and H.B. Warner played Jesus. So they were obviously two of the big players in that film just a few years before this, which I again didn't know until I was kind of digging into their filmography and some of the research that went into this. And then H.B. Warner also is probably familiar to more general movie audiences as Mr. Gower in It's a Wonderful Life.
Wow, I did not even realize that. And that's one of my favorite movies, and I did not even make that connection. That's so cool.
Yeah, you have to go back and watch it again and see if you can pick them
Yeah,
up.
I can't wait to watch it again this Christmas and be like,
Yep.
"Hey, that's that's Hamilton." No, I thought they were really, really great in this movie, especially Warner as Hamilton. Like, especially getting some background on him. He did, he was a little older, he was a widower. There was kind of a sadness to his performance that I think, was pretty nuanced. So, and, like, learning that background about, like, the real person kind of contextualize that for me. So I really enjoyed his performance especially.
I agree, and we'll actually be returning to him a couple times. He was nominated for Best Supporting Actor for his appearance in the 1937 version of Lost Horizon, and he's actually appeared in a couple of other Oscar nominees down the road. So we'll obviously bring up his name as we get to those films. Ian Keith, who plays Gravel. I don't remember if I talked about him at all. He was in Two Arabian Nights, which was nominated at the first Academy Awards. One of the roles that jumped out to me in a few years from this point in time is he played John Wilkes Booth in a 1930 film just titled Lincoln. And he was also Ramses the First in the Ten Commandments, the great epic from the, I think it was late 50s. So he was pretty well traveled in terms, and obviously made the transition into sound pictures if he was still around in the 50s.
So I don't have too much to say about too much to add with about him, but yeah.
Marie Dressler, she was the mother, Mrs. Hart. Not too much on her. She, I guess, was really prolific in the early silent era, and then in the 18 or thereabouts, she kind of stopped acting before returning to the screen in the late 20s, and would actually end up being nominated for 2 Academy Awards and winning one in 1932 for her role in the film Emma. So we'll obviously come back to her as well. The one thing I wanted to say about her is that I feel bad that she just kind of disappears halfway through this film. I feel once we get to Naples and those scenes I was talking about earlier, we hardly ever see her again, if at all.
Yeah, and she's such an interesting presence, like, a bit of comedic relief, especially I could see her being more of a comedic relief. In the beginning, you are kind of, like I said, you're led to believe this is gonna be more of a, like, My Fair Lady situation, and Mrs. Hart is definitely part of that. Like, you can even the titles even, like, spell out her Cockney accent in a
Yeah.
really funny way. And she's great. She's a very funny, very, big presence. So yeah, I definitely missed her too because you really only see her in the first act, and I think she could have been used to bring a little more levity to some of these
Yeah.
scenes at times. But yeah, I've seen Marie Dressler in a couple things, and I always enjoy seeing her pop up. She's great.
Yeah, it was funny as I was preparing for this. I So the first Academy Awards, there was a woman, Louise Dresser, no L in the last name, who was
Yeah.
nominated for Best Actress. And for some reason, I had thought that it was the same person, and then I started researching her. I'm like, no, this is not the same person at all. It's completely different.
Yeah, yeah.
Anything else on any of the other actors? Most of the rest of the folks are smaller roles, but anything, the king and queen, anybody else you want to touch on?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think we pretty much covered the main players here. I'm blanking on who played the queen, but she was also very good.
According to Wikipedia, it says Dorothy Cumming was the queen,
Okay, yeah, she was great.
who I'm also now seeing played the Virgin Mary in The King of Kings. So if I'd gone a little bit further down the list, I would have found another King of Kings connection there.
All right, there you go.
These folks had all worked together at one point in the past.
Totally, yeah, it was all everybody just coming together
Yeah, yeah.
to make these movies all the time.
So obviously, mentioned at the top, the film is based on the novel *The Divine Lady*, a romance of Nelson and Emma Hamilton by E. Barrington, who I found out the author's real name was Lily Adams Beck. E. Barrington was not her real name. I tried to read the novel. It's available online on Project Gutenberg. You can have it's full text available for free if can't find it at a library or anything nearby. I couldn't get into it at all. I read about a chapter and a half, and I couldn't slog through it. It was like 350 pages. And just like I'm just gonna go watch the movie. So I tried.
Seems like it would be pretty dry.
Yeah, it seemed like I was getting a lot of setup at the very beginning, and there was not a whole lot of action going on. So
Yeah.
we'll jump into the movie and get it from there.
Yeah, that is the nice thing about the movie is you don't get and you don't really need a ton of exposition, like, you do kinda just jump right in.
Yeah.
So I do appreciate that about the movie.
And obviously, we mentioned earlier kind of we were looking around for some information on the production, especially with those naval battle scenes.
Mhm.
I wasn't really able to find much in terms of the production whatsoever. I don't know if you found anything on any other part of the film other than the naval battles.
No, and generally, I wasn't finding too much, like, just written about this
Yeah.
film, altogether, and it's a story that's been told on film a few times as far as, like, the affair between Horatio and Lady Hamilton. I think there was a movie in the '40s that got some attention. I think Vivian Leigh maybe played Emma in that one. But yeah, not a ton. You really have to do some digging to find anything about and not a lot about the actual production itself,
Yeah.
which is a little disappointing.
Yeah, it's definitely been, just looking at Emma Hart, Emma Hamilton's Wikipedia page. There's a whole section of in popular culture. So she's been, whether or not it's
Mhm.
been focused on her, she's been represented in film many, many times. So it might be an interesting kind of side quest to go and check some of those other ones out to see how they portray her.
Yeah, definitely.
But in terms of this film, obviously, we have it readily available online and everything. It's actually been through a preservation process with the UCLA Film and Television Archive, Museum of Modern Art's Film Department, in cooperation with the Czechoslovak Film Archive. I don't know why they have an interest in it, but hey, we'll take whatever preservation we can get.
Yeah, truly. Thanks to the Czechs for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And then in terms of reviews, that's another thing. Not a whole lot in terms of
Mhm.
contemporary reviews. The one that I was able to find was from Photoplay magazine. One quote I pulled out says, "Although the screen version glosses over the famous Emma's indiscretions and does not tell exactly how the daughter of a cook became the most talked about woman in all Europe during the dying days of the 18th century and the first years of the 19th, it has genuine pictorial beauty," which I thought summed it up pretty well.
Yeah, I would agree. It does seem like it was pretty not a modern review, obviously, but it was pretty well received at the time, and for good reason. Like I found the review in Harrison's reports that was very favorable. Said it was a very ambitious production, which is true. Rightly belongs to the $2 class, both from the point of view of expenditure of money as well as from that of appealing qualities. So they really they liked Corinne Griffith a lot, and obviously these like battle scenes and set pieces. Yeah, it is interesting because I guess, I'm thinking back then this story was probably more widely known. So I think maybe
Yeah.
people were more familiar. And I'm just dumb about history and wasn't familiar with this story at all. But it does seem like there was more of a familiarity with this story of their affair back then. So I think maybe people were more interested in seeing the story on screen was maybe a bigger deal. And yeah, it seemed like it was pretty well received at the time.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, obviously, I was aware of. I knew the name,
Hmm.
the names of the people, but just in terms of a U.S. centric history that I went through in high school and college, the focus is the pre-Revolutionary War, the Revolutionary War. Oh, and then a bunch of stuff happened in Europe, and then there's the Civil War. It's like we kind of skip over
Yeah.
that whole early, late 1700s, early 1800s. Once the U.S. is established, oh, and by the War of 1812, there's a little thing there, but
Yeah.
everything
Yeah.
going on outside of our own shores just kind of didn't matter in the history books that I had with growing up.
Yeah. Kind of the typical like American centric
Yep. Yep.
point of view.
If it's not right in front of our face, we don't care about it.
Pretty much. Yeah.
At the Oscars, I'm already mentioned at the top, but the Divine Lady won Frank Lloyd the award for Best Director, Second Academy Award. He defeated two of his other films, Drag and Weary River, which we just talked about a couple of weeks back, as well as Harry Beaumont for The Broadway Melody, Irving Cummings for In Old Arizona, Lionel Barrymore for Madam X, and Ernst Lubitsch for The Patriot. So all of those will have been or have already been covered on the podcast this season, with the exception of Drag and The Patriot, as those are lost. We've already talked a lot about Corinne Griffith, her nomination for Best Actress. She lost out to Mary Pickford in Coquette, which I'll actually be covering next week. And John F. Seats, nominated for Best Cinematography, lost out to White Shadows in the South Seas. And I think of the ones that I've seen that have been nominated for Best Cinematography, I think this is probably the closest contender to fight with White Shadows. White Shadows in the South Seas has beautiful South Pacific locations to shoot, so it kind of gets a little bit of a bonus there. But I think out of any of the other ones that I've seen, this one is probably the closest, especially with some of those battle scenes, to a very close second in my eyes.
Yeah, definitely. I'll have to check out that White Shadows in the South Seas because yeah, the only other cinematography nominee I've seen would be in Old Arizona, and that one to me wasn't like super impressive cinematography wise.
Yeah, I think that one. I mean, the big draw there is those Western vistas that they show in various sequences. But yeah, in terms of
Yeah.
the scenes outside of those big outdoor sequences, which aren't really that many in that film,
Hmm.
I think that it does lag a little bit behind these other two.
Yeah, and then the best actress category this year was like a bit controversial because Mary Pickford, obviously, married to Douglas Fairbanks, the
Yeah.
Academy president. And I haven't seen Coquette yet, so maybe I'm just biased, but my pick for best actress this year was Bessie Love. Even though the Broadway Melody is not my favorite movie, I'm like a big Bessie Love fan, especially in that movie. I think she really does a lot that's commendable in that movie. And then I think Corinne Griffith is great in this one. I wasn't familiar with her work prior to this. I definitely want to seek out more of her stuff after seeing her in this. I found her very like intriguing and pretty well cast as like this well-known beauty of the
Yeah.
time. So I think she would probably come in a close second for me here.
Yeah, obviously, I'll get to more of my thoughts on Pickford and Coquette next week, because that's the next film
Yeah.
up. But I have already seen it, and it's for me. I think it's a very close race between the ones that I've seen. The only one that but the two that I haven't seen yet, which will be covered, are The Letter and Madam X, Ruth Chatterton. So
Mhm.
I've still got two more to go to finish out all of the available nominees for that category. For me, it is fairly close race between Pickford and Corinne Griffith and Bessie Love. I really enjoyed all of those performances so far. Well, anything else that you want to touch on before we give some final thoughts and some ratings?
Just because I'm a big nerd about how much things cost back then or how much, the box office power of some of these movies back then compared to today. I did look up it looked like it grossed about 465,000 domestically when it came out in 1929. That equates to almost 9 million today, so not too bad.
Not too shabby.
I think in the list that I found, it was, like, 92nd that year. So, not great, but respectable, I would say.
Considering how fast they were cranking movies out back then.
Yeah, and
by the
considering
dozens.
Frank Lloyd made 3 this
Right.
year,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
yeah, crazy. So yeah, not, not too bad. I just always like to kinda contextualize,
Sure.
how successful it was for the time.
Yeah, definitely. I like seeing those as well. The one other thing I wanted to mention, I don't know why I wrote this down, but I felt just going back to Gravel real quick, how
Mhm.
schizophrenic he is at times in the movie. He's
Yeah.
one not even one scene to another, but one shot to another, he'll be saying, "Oh, Emma, you're doing great," and then they'll cut away to something else in the very next shot. "Oh, you're back in the doghouse. You're not, you've done something wrong," and it's like she didn't do anything in the last 2 seconds when we cut away from you. So, I wanted to I wanted to call that out. And then the one other thing, I tried to start doing some digging on this, but there's a scene fairly early in the film where they're at a some sort of fair,
Mhm.
country fair, something like that, and there's carnival rides. And I was trying to like, there's almost like a Ferris wheel type thing, and I was trying to find out, did those sorts of things exist in the 1700s, or was it just we've got these derelicts rides from a Coney Island type place that we want to throw in the film, and we're gonna spruce them up and make them look a little bit older. So I wasn't able to find out if any of those things actually did exist, but it was something me. One of the things that I always notice in films are kind of those chronologically inaccurate things that happen in films oftentimes when the continuity
Totally.
folks aren't doing their jobs. But I'll have to do a little more digging on that and see.
That's a good point. I actually have some knowledge of this because a friend of mine traveled to Copenhagen recently, and apparently out there they have the world's oldest amusement park.
The Tivoli, yes, I've actually been there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. See, and I don't know what kind of rides it would have been at that point, but certainly not like, a mechanical like carousel or whatever, that we would know it as. But yeah, that is interesting. I am curious. So it's definitely something that would have existed, but yeah, what exactly it was made up of at the time would be interesting to know more about. Cause yeah, I found that, and because when my friend like posted about it, I was like, oh my God, I can't believe that this is such an old concept. I never thought about it before like that, but that is interesting. That was something that didn't even cross my mind as I'm watching it. Maybe because I've seen a bunch of movies lately that involve like fairs that I was just kind of like in fair mode. Like I watched State Fair recently, I watched Lonesome recently, so I think I was just getting lost in the moment, but that's a good point.
Yeah, definitely need to do a little bit more digging on that. But it was one of those things that I saw and I was just kind of like, that doesn't quite feel right for 1790, whatever year we're in.
Yeah, looks a little out of place
Maybe
for the times they
1890, but not 1790.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Again, all the more reason to have, wish that we had more information on the actual like production of the movie.
Exactly. Well, we'll get on to some ratings here. I do mine out of 10. So I'll go first. I actually gave this a 7 out of 10. I thought some of the, like we've talked about the battle scenes, a lot of the cinematography things, even a lot of the production design, some of the stuff were really great. Costumes in a lot of the scenes, especially those Queen's Court, that sequence where they're all dolled up. I thought that those costumes were really great. There's some other pieces that aren't quite as strong, but I think balances that out to about a 7 for me.
Okay, cool. I'm very neutral, I think, about this movie. I think I would probably give it very solid middle of the road, a 5 out of 10. Yeah, love the production design, love the cinematography. Those battle set pieces are really, astonishing, a
Yeah.
huge achievement. I appreciated the acting. I thought the acting was great. I think the story lost me. There were a few times where I just kind of zoned out and would have to rewind and go back because like what? Because again, history is not my thing, so maybe that's, playing a role. Maybe I'm judging a little harshly just based on the topic, but I think I also found the story to be like a little unfocused. It was kind of like we have kind of a lukewarm romance and set against like a lukewarm like war movie. So it wasn't doing too much for me in either of those respects. So I kind of wish we'd gotten, because the more that I read about Emma was I was honestly pretty fascinated by her life, and so I'm eager to check out some of these other movies that have been made about her or read more about her, because I found they left out a lot of stuff. Like, she and, Horatio had a daughter that's just never brought up. And there's a whole like beginning of her life where she's a muse for George Romney, who's in the beginning of this movie, and he's the artist in the beginning of this movie. We never really touch on that part of it. Like he made so many portraits of her, famous ones. So I'm like, I kind of want to know a little bit more about that, like how she
Yeah.
became like his muse. So I felt like even though I felt like she was portrayed very well, and if we were to really get into go down the rabbit hole of her life, we would probably end up with like a 3-hour movie. So obviously they couldn't fit everything in that I personally would have liked to have seen. Maybe another director can, revisit her story today. Maybe that would be a fun project for somebody to take on. But yeah, it was like a little tonally uneven for me too. Like in the beginning, like you see Marie Dressler kind of doing like some very comedic, acting, and she really set a tone that really didn't stick throughout,
Yeah.
which was interesting. And Corinne Griffith does, like, some things in the beginning too, and maybe this is supposed to speak more to, like, her, upbringing as she's, starts out, like but she's, like, making faces at people and, maybe that's supposed to, like, indicate her vulgarity, but it came off a little bit more just straight comedy, and so that I found that to be, like, a little uneven, but, overall, I was happy to watch it twice. I don't know if I'll be eager to revisit it anytime soon.
Yeah, I think to your point, it would be really much stronger if it was the war movie and there was a little bit of the romance, or the romance movie and there's a little bit of the war. I think if they had
Yeah,
focused in on either one of those and kind of had the other one just in a very minimal backup role, I think it would have elevated the whole thing
exactly.
significantly. The other thing too, I think, is if they had focused on a single time period. It
Yeah.
starts in 1780 whatever and it ends in the 18. It's a 20-year time period that they're trying to cover here,
Yeah.
and that's a lot. If they focused on just that part of trying to get the supplies from the folks in Naples, or just the return to England and kind of everything that goes on there, I think it would have made it a little bit more focused in terms of the overall story.
Yeah, and that's kind of a theme with the Frank Lloyd movies that I've seen, actually, come to think of it. So that happens, like, in East Lynne and in Cavalcade too, so
Yeah,
maybe that's just a pattern with him,
yeah.
but
He's still honing his focus there, I think.
yeah, and to that point too, like we mentioned earlier, you don't even meet Horatio till you're well into the movie already. So like their romance doesn't have as big of an impact for me. Like we don't see them together enough. The beginnings of their relation, like it doesn't feel earned.
Yeah, no, totally agree. Well, I will be sure to include a list of resources, any links to the articles, the reviews that we mentioned, as well as where you can watch The Divine Lady for yourself if you're so inclined. Janelle, thank you so much for coming on the show to talk about this film. Remind people where they can find your work one more time.
Yeah, you can find me on Substack with my Oscar-related newsletter called "Right Now You Like Me." Currently on like a bit of a hiatus while I like retool like the formatting, but I'm coming up on a year of posting there, so hopefully I'll be back soon with more posts.
Wonderful. And don't forget to follow the Oscar Project at theoscarproject.substack.com. Be sure to come back for next Friday's episode of the podcast, where I will be discussing the film Coquette. Thank you for listening, and I will see you at the movies.
You are